Hello, good evening. I'm Madeline Maceda Heidi. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for the American School of Bombay. We're so fortunate to have Dr. David Souza with us tonight. As a consultant in educational neuroscience, working with educators in schools all around the world, and having written 16 books and dozens of articles, Dr. Souza is highly knowledgeable about how current research on the brain can be used to form strategies for improving learning. Dr. Souza started out with a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Massachusetts State College, and then he got a Master of Arts teaching degree in science from Harvard University and a doctorate from Rutgers. He taught high school science, was a K-12 director of science, a supervisor of instruction, and a district superintendent in New Jersey. He's also been an adjunct professor of education at Seton Hall University and a visiting lecturer at Rutgers University and a past president of the National Staff Development Council. Tonight, Dr. Souza is here to speak with us about the topic of ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a condition that affects many children around the world and is often both undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and overdiagnosed. For parents and educators, ADHD poses complex questions of how best to serve students who have ADHD within our existing systems. I'm delighted to present such a knowledgeable and credible educator to enlighten us about this important topic. Please welcome Dr. David Souza.
I'd like to talk to you today about a topic that's concerned me greatly in the last few years. We know that there's a condition known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, probably a genetic condition that's a spectral disorder from very mild to extreme. People with mild form of ADHD probably don't even know they have it, or they've adapted to it very easily. Those with more severe, moderate or more severe forms of it do have trouble concentrating. And attention, of course, is very important if we want to learn something. Most learning occurs when we are focused on what we're trying to learn. So attention is a major contributor to our ability to learn. What I'm concerned about is the idea that every time a student is misbehaving or not paying attention, that maybe something is wrong with him. Now, don't get me wrong. Any person who has the legitimate disease, who really is diagnosed as having the condition known as ADHD, should definitely get the medical and other types of therapy that are available for those people. What I'm concerned about is the idea that we jump too quickly to the conclusion that a misbehaving student, or a student who's not focused, or a student who's doing something else while we expect him to do the task at hand may have the disorder. So I'm going to talk to you about ways in which kids can behave as though they have ADHD but not have it. And I worry that we don't give enough attention to that. We're too quick to jump to the idea that lack of attention is a disorder. Now, attention is very important. Not paying attention can get you in trouble if you're not reading the signs. But attention is also critical for being able to acquire information and to learn skills. A lot of this work has been done for over the past 20 years, looking at what are the cerebral systems that make up attention. One of the things we come to the conclusion is that there are three systems involved in the attention-getting apparatus of our brain. The first system is what we call the alerting system. This is where our brain perceives something in the environment, some signal in the environment lets us know that there's something we ought to pay attention to. Remember, the brain's main job is to keep us alive. And so when there's something in the environment that's unexpected, the brain has to assess it to decide whether it's going to be a threat or not to our existence. So the alerting signal is very important. The next thing we try to do is say, look, turn toward the source of that information, that unusual input, to see whether or not it's a threat. And then after we see what's going on, we have to make a decision what to do. And a simple example would be if you're walking through the park and all of a sudden you hear a rustle in the bushes. Well, that's the alerting signal. And then you turn toward that noise to see whether or not the cause of it is going to be a problem. And if a rabbit jumps up, then we make the decision, this is not a threat, and we move on. On the other hand, if that happens to be a snake that pops up, then of course the decision is quite different, which is to get away from that as quickly as possible. Now, with these three systems necessary to receive information, to orient toward it, and to make a decision about what to do, things can go wrong here and there. And some of these things that can go wrong have genetic predispositions for them. But there are also other things that can cause a distraction, that can cause us to look like we're not paying attention when we don't really have a medical disorder. So let me take a few minutes to talk about that. And I guess the reason I'm really concerned about this is the incredible increase in the number of children who have been diagnosed with ADHD, medically diagnosed with ADHD. Now, this information comes from the Center of Disease Control in the United States. And as you can see, in 2003, roughly 8% of school children or children between the ages of 4 and 17 were diagnosed, medically diagnosed with ADHD. That number just 4 years later jumped to 9.5%. But one thing we have to remember is that this is voluntary reporting to the Center for Disease Control. And there were researchers out there who believed that a lot of the medically diagnosed individuals were not being reported. And so in 2010, they got together and they called and contacted over 1,000 medical practitioners around the country and asked them how many referrals they made for medical diagnosis of ADHD. And their results were quite surprising. By the way, in 2007, that number of children, almost 5.5 million children diagnosed with ADHD. When they did that study in 2010, the number is quite different. Almost 18%. Almost 1 out of 5 children were being diagnosed with this disorder. And that translates to almost 10.5 million children. Well, why is this? What's going on here? Look at this almost exponential leap in just 7 years, from 7.5% to more than double at 18%. Are we getting better at diagnosing it? Or is there something else in the environment that's prompting this behavior, that's causing it to come forth and then asking us to take a look at it and say, yep, that's ADHD? I don't think so. I think what's happening here is that we're too quick to jump at that notion that it's ADHD without looking at other possibilities. And so let's take a look at what some of those possibilities are. What kind of behavior, what kind of conditions could produce ADHD-like behavior when in fact the person does not have ADHD? Diet. Let's take a look at diet first. And one of our biggest things to consider here is caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. We know it's a brain stimulant. There have been studies that show that participants who take some caffeine shortly before a cognitive task will do better than those who don't. It's not a long-term effect, but it is an effect in improving cognitive processing. Now, the recommended maximum dose of caffeine for adolescents is about 85 milligrams a day. That's maximum dose. Now, take a look at a cup of coffee, and that'll have somewhere between 90 and 100 milligrams, depending on how it's brewed. Now, if 85 milligrams is what we say is the maximum amount for adolescents, let's take a look at some of the things that adolescents put in their bodies. And these may look familiar to you. In fact, you walk around school grounds, you see cans of these things on the ground, empty cans of them. And now let me show you how much caffeine they have. And by the way, this is for 8 ounces. Many of those products are sold in 12-ounce cans, which means it's 50% more than the amounts you see there. So what happens is when you get too much caffeine in your body, if you've ever had too much caffeinated beverages such as coffee or too much tea, then you know what happens. You get irritable and you get hyperactive. So caffeine is one of the major contributors, I believe, to hyperactivity in our school children. And it doesn't mean that they need to be diagnosed with the disorder. It means you have to watch their diet. Let's take a look at another one, aspartame. Now, remember, aspartame is perfectly safe for adults in moderate quantities, but it's all over the place. It's not just in your artificial sweetener. In North America, there are over 6,000 products alone that contain aspartame. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of those products right here as well. And now let's take a look at what's the average recommended dose of this particular chemical. Now again, remember, it's safe for most adults in reasonable quantities. What I'm concerned about is the effect it has on the growing brain. Remember, we're talking about developing brains here. That's the key, developing brains. And if the maximum dose is about 8 milligrams a day, let's take what we find. A recent study done of youth in Chicago showed that they were getting anywhere from 100 to 250 milligrams a day from the diet sodas they were drinking, from other products that they had in the course of the day. And as you can see, that's 10, 15, 20 times or more, up to 30 times more than the amount that's recommended. And we have studies that show that excess aspartate in the body, especially of younger children, does produce hyperactivity. So that's another diet element we need to look at. Food preservatives are also an interesting thing to take a look at here. And there's studies that look at 3 particularly, and those are sodium benzoate, benzoic acid, and the food colorings. Now, when they've looked at these, they find that excess amounts of these products also cause hyperactivity. A number of studies that show that. Now, again, want to remind you, these are perfectly safe for most adults in reasonable quantities. The problem is how much they're taking in the young body. And why are kids getting more food preservatives? Because they're eating more preserved foods. In many homes, they have a preserved breakfast, a preserved snacks, preserved lunch. Anything you take out of the freezer, anything that's packaged has some kind of preservative in it. And we don't spend enough time cooking fresh foods for our kids. And what happens then is they get this excess dosage of food preservatives. And excess quantities in children can produce hyperactivity. Sleep deprivation is another big one. Studies in the United States and Canada show that the average high school student gets about 5 to 6 hours of sleep per school night. Yet the body clock for most kids is programmed to 8 or 9 hours. And so if they're only getting 6 hours, they get up, they have sleep deprivation. The sleep hormone called melatonin is still present in the blood. And as far as we know, there are just 2 ways really to get melatonin out of the blood, and that is with light. Light helps to drive it out of the system and to shut down the melatonin pump, or to finish the sleep cycle, as some kids do, either on the bus on the way to school, or sometimes in first period class. They're just doing what nature tells them to do, finish the sleep cycle. If they don't do that, then they have sleep deprivation, and that can make them quite irritable and also hyperactive. This feeds into another condition we need to look at, and that is stress. Children can be under all kinds of stress. Stress at home because of domestic violence, stress because of a bullying sibling, stress because of drugs, stress because of pressure from the parents to do well, and make sure you get all those A's, and the pressure of that. It produces stress, and whenever we have stress in our mind, it produces an excess amount of cortisol. Now, cortisol is the stress hormone. We always have a little bit in our blood. It helps keep us alert. But when we are under stress, the amount of cortisol dumped into the blood increases dramatically, the purpose of which is to say to the brain, hey, try to find out what that source of the stress is and eliminate it if you can. So when you're under stress, this cortisol, if it stays in the body for too long, it produces excess cortisol produces hyperactive behavior. Now, there's an unfortunate downward spiral here, because when you have excess cortisol in the blood, you don't sleep very well, so you get insomnia. So the insomnia then is sleep deprivation, which then causes more stress, and you have to try to break that cycle. Anyway, the result is some pretty jittery and hyperactive people. Another one that I think we need to look at is not being taught the rules of behavior. Many of you here, probably when you were children, you had dinner with your parents or your caregivers, you sat down, you talked about what's going on in school, and they found out how things are going. They taught you, by the way, I know my parents said, there are some things you can do here at home that you better not do in school, and you better not do in church, and you better not do in the supermarket. And so we learned that there are certain rules of behavior that went with certain environments. What's happening today is they don't have that conversation very often. A surprising study that came out just 2 years ago showed that kids spend 15 times more time in the course of a week attending to their technology than they do talking to their caregivers. So they're spending that much more time connecting to their outside world than to their inside world, where they should be learning what the rules of behavior are. So these kids are not malevolent, they're just ignorant, and they need to be taught what those rules of behavior are. They don't have ADHD, they just don't have the information they need to know how to behave in certain circumstances. Another one I'd like to look at is school-induced ADHD. Might think about that for a moment. What does he possibly mean by that? What could we mean by school-induced ADHD? Well, we've got a 21st century brain coming across our thresholds. And that 21st century brain is used to now interacting with its environment, to be part of the learning process, to search out information. That's what that brain is used to now. But if you have a school where it's just sit down, listen to the teacher, listen to the sage on the stage, give the information, then the environment isn't compatible with the brain with the way the brain is trying to learn. And so one way you could summarize this is to say that what I mean by that is you've got a 21st century brain in a 20th century school. And these kids get restless, they don't see the meaning of what they're learning, and as a result, they become hyperactive. And there are a couple of other things, too, that can cause these ADHD-like symptoms. Environmental factors, such as drugs, of course, and also heavy metals in the environment. We've done a pretty good job of getting lead reduced dramatically in our environment, but there's some others. Cadmium now is becoming a problem because cadmium was in batteries up to till about 10 years ago or so, and that cadmium now, those batteries are thrown away. It's in the garbage dumps, and it's, as the batteries disintegrate, the cadmium leaches into the water table and eventually into our environment. So that's another one to watch for. And then heavy metal poisoning, one of the signs of it is hyperactivity. And also, of course, physical disorders, such as obsessive compulsive behavior and psychological disorder too. Dyslexia, if the child's having trouble reading the information, then becomes restless and hyperactive. So my whole purpose here today is to say, look, kids will be kids. They'll act out. They'll misbehave. Their attention will drift because they found something else that captures it. It doesn't mean they have a psychological disorder. It may mean and some of these other things. All I'm saying is we want to make sure that before we put a medical diagnosis on a kid and say you have to go on medication, prescription medication, that we are sure we've looked at all these other things, checked out all these other possibilities before we decide that medical evaluation is the final resort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Souza.